Okay, well, I'm going to assume everything is in working order because Cherry has been amazing. And I want to start by thanking her for this wonderful invitation. I'm going to put a lot on the table, and then I really look forward to speaking together. And so thanks again, Cherry. So here we are all indoors, and I hope that all of you are safe and that you have what you need. And I want to thank you for being here and for this chance to meet together and have this conversation and to plan together where we're going from here. At least we're able to do this. When I wake each day, I'm glad to be alive. I'm glad for my life. I'm glad for what I'm able to do. And then this wave comes over me of profound pain. I feel the pain of women in this world, knowing that with every breath I take, a woman and a girl or a girl is being raped, banished, tortured in the cruelest way possible, held captive, murdered. I feel this every day. I live to see the change. I live to see women in leadership of this world, and I live to heal all of the people and our Mother Earth herself. I wake each day the lesbian feminist that I am. So I'm going to take you on a journey, my particular journey over the last half century. I'm 71 years old now, 50 years of living my life to the fullest and consciously as a lesbian feminist. The how and the why, and always the hope that our meeting together today will give us the chance to talk about what this topic means to you and where we're headed. My feminism came early and it came naturally. I'm told that I was born yelling. And I was the only girl with 5 brothers, a rich field of study. I also had a forward-thinking mother who declared in the 1950s that as a family we were a collective and that all members of the family were expected to do housework. None of my girlfriends had the same. My childhood was loving and protected. Nevertheless, I met my first stranger in the park at the age of 7. I never told my parents because I instinctively knew that my freedom to roam would be reined in. I was frustrated that I had to wear shirts after the age of 9. I did not understand why I couldn't go biking with my girlfriends to picnic in the fields at the age of 10. And at 11, my mother was forced to carry a dead fetus for 2 months. I presume the doctors suspected her of wanting an abortion. I remember her pain at that loss, and I realized much later that she must have been terrified that she could have died. The hospital operated on her finally on Valentine's Day. The cruelty of misogynist enjoyment of mental torture for women. In high school, I was asked why there were no books on the curriculum written by women. I was told that no woman has ever written anything worth publishing. Such was my introduction to the censorship of what, unknown to me at that time, was so many women what so many women had accomplished. At that point, I knew nothing about the fight for women to be doctors, the stolen discoveries of science, the history of the fight for the vote, the civil rights movement in the US and in my own country, the African American women heroes working on the Underground Railway, the racism faced by Viola Desmond in Nova Scotia, the fight for women's suffrage in Canada, which began in 1916 and did not end until 1960, when finally Indigenous women and men were finally able to vote. I had no history of the truth of what was done as Canada formed to Indigenous people here, and I had no idea of how much was being hidden from us of our own history of matters of importance to us as women. Sorry, I'm missing my, looking for my page. I've got a page mixed up here. Okay, sorry. In my teens, I worked as a lifeguard, being mocked as a small woman that I would never pass the test, but I passed them. When they were planning to hire a younger man who I had taught swimming to be the next assistant manager, I fought it. It was my turn, and I became the first woman assistant manager in my area, and had public servants from the area coming to see whether I knew how to do a water test every day. In university, I got onto the student council to challenge that birth control was not allowed on campus. This was the late 1960s. On campus, I met some women who were writing the birth control handbook, which was published as an illegal book at that time. 6 of us opened the first English Women's Center here in 1969, and we distributed it under the table. Within 3 months, we were hundreds, holding consciousness-raising groups, affectionately known as CR groups, on all sorts of topics, from what to do about violence by men to shared unpaid home labor to what orgasms were all about. This was the first women's space I had ever experienced, apart from my always cherished conversations with my girlfriends. In that center, we discussed things we would not have allowed ourselves to even think about if we had not been women only. We could speak about things that we were unsure of without being labeled ignorant or insignificant. We spoke openly about our lives, including sexual assaults, which in public, if we had spoken, would have carried stigma, possibly loss of jobs. When the center was up and running, we decided to advertise a party, a celebration of what we were building together. The topic of men came up. Women wanted to invite their boyfriends to see this special place and understand its importance. After a long discussion, we agreed to open the doors to men, hoping that through that one night, they might have a better understanding of the importance of women's centers. One of the main reasons we needed these centers was that in the 1960s through the 1970s, we had one doctor in Montreal who was committed to providing abortions, to prevent women from dying, because they were, from backstreet abortions. Women came here to Montreal from many parts of Canada, the United States, and other countries looking for this help. So we had one room with pillows and blankets as a safe and comfortable place for women to come before and after having an abortion. Well, that evening, one man went upstairs and threw black paint everywhere with ugly slogans slapped against the walls. I know it was only one man, but it caused a mess, and it took a lot of energy to clean it up, and a lot of energy to settle the feelings of having been invaded. We realized how important it was in many ways to be able to trust who was in that women's center for our own discussions and for women coming in. It was the only way for women coming in to even dare to allow thoughts, needs, and stories to flow. There was no such thing as a computer. We communicated and learned from each other through telephones, letters, and visiting each other's women's centers when we could. Very occasionally, we made a big enough splash to get onto the news, and we continued to grow. In the 1970s and increasingly in the 80s, the women's and lesbian movements grew powerful through books. Women wrote about past women activists hidden from history, and we began to understand on a deeper level how long we had been silenced. Books and newsletters began to flow. A book all about women is another form of women-only space. A time finally focused on what was happening now and throughout time to women. Some books that changed our lives in the 1970s. Cables of Rage, Audre Lorde. Sexual Politics, Kate Millett. Sisterhood is Powerful, Robin Morgan. Against Our Will, Susan Brown Miller. Gynecology, Mary Daly. On Secrets and Lies, Adrienne Rich. When God Was a Woman, Merlin Stone. Lesbian Women, Del Martin and Phyllis Lyons. The Suppressed History Archives, Max Dashu. And through music. Early on, Nina Simone, Alex Dopkin, Sweet Honey in the Rock. It's impossible to name them all here, but now we have computers. We're still able to find them and read them and listen to the ways that they built the lesbian and feminist culture. During this time, I traveled through Europe alone. Why not me, I thought. Why not me as a woman? A feminist action. My right to see the world. It was a defiance that taught me how many men feel that they have the right to grab at any woman traveling by herself. I wanted to travel to North Africa and went with an ex-boyfriend, a good friend, knowing that it was the only really safe way for me to go. This too was an eye-opener for me, reading La Femme Algérienne as I traveled and meeting exactly 4 women in 4 months. I had stones thrown at me by boys, and I barely escaped an attempt to kidnap me into trafficking. I was 22 years old. My commitment to women everywhere profoundly deepened. In my early 20s, I felt an expectation, not so much from family, but from society, that as a young woman I would marry. I had a recurring dream that I would agree to marry and that my mother and aunts were thrilled, but I was full of dread that this was not what I wanted to do with my life. I would agree to marry, the day would arrive, and I would be heading into the ceremony and thinking, if you don't leave now, it's going to be even harder to get out of this later. Every time I would run, jump in my car, which in my dreams at that time was a small convertible, and take off into the woods with the wind blowing in my hair to go camping. So I listened to this dream. And one day I met a woman, and in becoming friends, she asked if I had ever met a lesbian. And I said, no, but that I imagined I might meet one day. She asked how I thought I might meet one. And I said, well, I don't know, maybe meeting one walking in the street by chance. I barely knew the word. She said, well, I'm a lesbian. She became my first woman lover, and I will never forget that first kiss. In my mind, I thought, this is what I've been waiting for. I stopped dating men, not from a hatred of men, for the love of a woman. A new and magical women-only space. My first love had come out in the bars at the age of 16. She said, "You show me the women's movement and I'll show you the bars." I found out about the protocol at that time for butches and femmes, that certain butches had their own tables, that you didn't mess with tradition. My generation brought a free-flowing bunch of loving women dancing alone, in pairs, in circles, dancing our feet off until dawn. A new women's space. New places to grow, to celebrate our love for each other, our lesbian culture, in all of its variety. Celebrating our cultures within lesbian culture, falling in love, dancing, dancing, dancing. At that time, a half a dozen of us met to discuss forming a lesbian movement, in addition to our work in the women's movement. The 1970s brought a lot of movements: anti-war, the earth, for the earth, the lesbian movement, and a gay movement. Alliances were formed, and the then GLBT, which became the LGBT, to rebalance an early dismissiveness of lesbians, was born. Parades in June in memory of the Stonewall riots were now enormous, spectacular. Celebrations across North America. It became somewhat easier to be out. Being both a lesbian and a feminist, I never understood the antagonism of some heterosexual women toward lesbian feminists. I knew that there was a fear that we would make the feminist cause seem too radical, that we were asking too much. This was one of the early divisions within the women's movement. Was it a movement for every woman, or was it to open doors for some women who fit in culturally, racially, class-wise to society as it was? Here's a description by Barbara Smith, quoted back to her by Cherry Moraga, a discussion that they were having about a third world feminist perspective, both lesbian feminists teaching women's studies. Quote, "Feminism that is not about freeing all women, which means working class women, women of color, physically challenged women, etc., is not feminism, but merely female self-aggrandizement." That was in 1982 from a book called Lesbian Studies. In 1973 and 4, I traveled back to Europe, this time to a camp for women on an island called Femø in Denmark. That was my first experience on women's land. There were about 250 of us, mostly Scandinavian and from other parts of Europe. There were a few from the US, one who was thinking of organizing a women's camp back home. This was bigger than the women's centers, and it brought women together from a few countries, and it was in nature. It was the first time I could dress as I wanted to as an adult. No shirt. I met the Danish Red Stockings, witnessed 20 feminists from Italy find each other there, none knowing that even one other feminist existed in her country. They spent the entire week planning together. We cooked and took care of the land and each other and felt a freedom and a level of discussion with each other that we had not experienced before. The seed was planted. Our commitment to reach beyond our own countries and to create change for women everywhere. And a commitment to creating these opportunities for women to meet, to heal, to plan, and to learn from each other. Men circled in their boats, but they couldn't get close to us, and we were in a safe space. Well, back in North America, many lesbians were planning to find land, live freely, and offer this freedom and connection to land to others. Stories were beginning to circulate about the freedom and power of living together on land. I moved with friends from Montreal to Vancouver with the plan one day to be on land together. 8 of us formed a lesbian collective called Lavender Hill, a women-only space. We had a special time. We learned a lot. We listened to all the new women's music. We wrote and spoke and gathered with women and other lesbians. We organized women's dances. We wrote newsletters. We were exploring and expanding what happens when lesbians have time with each other. We began to learn how to speak with each other with respect and with love. We were fledglings, but we grew. We were learning. In the 1970s, women's studies began to pop up in universities, and in the 1980s, lesbian studies were added. This was the outcome of those early women-centered discussions, which made it apparent that there was much to discuss that did not always involve all of the other subjects under the heading of women's studies. This is from Margaret Cruikshank's introduction to her book, Lesbian Studies, 1982. By creating a climate in which some academic women could come out as lesbians, women's studies has allowed us to find each other, to explore common concerns, and support each other's work. This was the outcome of a women's studies conference supporting, not denying, the necessity for lesbians to meet as lesbians within the conference. Lesbian professors were able to find each other, be out in numbers in their universities, and collaborate, bringing lesbian culture into women's studies and in carving out space also for lesbian studies too. In this case, the hard-won space for women's studies supported the harder-won space for lesbians to teach lesbian culture. But here is also what happened, and I quote, again from Margaret Cruikshank, 1982, one of the chief characteristics of the lesbian feminist educational movement is simply the euphoria of the women involved in it. This is due partly to the emergence from the closet and recognition of our sheer numbers, the emotional high women experience when we feel for the first time a passionate connection between our lives and our work is hard to describe to someone who has not directly felt it. Our teaching takes on a whole new dimension when we can be ourselves. Lesbian Studies, Margaret Cruikshank, 1982. So I want to pause here before going on to say again that there was such an outpouring of books written by feminists and by lesbian feminists that continued through the 1980s that I can't possibly do justice to them all. But to name a few of them tells the story. Remember, we had no computers. These were our lifeline. This Bridge Called My Back, writings by radical women of color, a feminist anthology by Jerry Moraga and Gloria E. Andaluza. Woman Hating, Andrea Dworkin. Lesbian Nation, Jill Johnson. Of Women Born, Adrienne Rich. Surfacing, Margaret Atwood. The Paradise Papers, Merlin Stone. The Color Purple, Alice Walker. The Coming Out Stories, Julia Penelope and Susan Wolfe. Don't, A Woman's Word, Ellie Danica. Ripening, Dreaming, Awakening, 3 almanacs of lesbian lore and vision, Lee Lanning and Ned Hart. Molly Molasses and Me, Zipsis and Georgia Mitchell, Cultural Etiquette, A Guide for the Well-Intentioned, Emoja Three Rivers, We Moon, Mother Tongue Inc. Reading a book by a feminist about her feminism, for me, gives me time in women-only space. Reading a book by a lesbian feminist is time for me in lesbian feminist space. As a lesbian feminist, I enter the space of learning from a sister as if I have the chance of sitting with her and listening to her. Consciousness-raising groups grew and they matured. Some were for planning, some were for healing, some were for spiritual ceremonies. Some were women's circles, some were lesbian circles. We learned how to raise energy for ourselves and for each other because almost all of us have experienced some form, if not multiple forms, of violence from men in the past. By this time, I had lived 10 years in Vancouver, working for social services, and I had pushed to be able to create the first groups for girls who had been sexually violated by men and boys. For me, lesbianism and feminism have a tight bond. I've always cared deeply for women, and by my early 30s had met hundreds who needed to sit with someone who cared, individually and in circles with others who had been through the same experiences. The 1980s was a time in which we fought and won government funding for many women's shelters. Shelters that were in secret locations so that women would feel safe, would be safe, having escaped violence from men. In the 1970s, we had exposed the amount of violence toward women by men and the number of women needing to escape from violent husbands. Many of us had learned self-defense to protect ourselves. Now we were pulling incest out from under the carpet. And I went across the country in my van, meeting women working at rape crisis centers and women's shelters. At those meetings, we spoke freely with each other. We spoke in that protected, women-only space that we had come to depend on. We knew the importance of this safe women-only space for the women escaping and needing to heal from the violence. We knew the importance of speaking in that women-only space where we were not accused of being biased, exaggerating, or being too radical. My next home was in Ottawa. I began to hold healing circles there for women, and I got entry into the prison for women, hearing stories from women inside over a period of 10 years. I also set up a nonprofit organization, Healing Center for Women, meeting women individually and in groups to make sure that they would get support for free. This too was women-only space. Without that space, many women would not have had the time or the feeling of safety to even allow themselves to remember and explore what had happened to them. I also contacted the Children's Aid Society in Ottawa to offer those groups for girls as a volunteer. The Children's Aid Society was glad to support the idea. It was new to them as it had been to the social services in Vancouver. But when I was asked to speak to a group in the community about the plan, a newspaper article got printed titled, "Children Almost Sent to Lesbian." Right-wing women appealed to the federal government to fire me because my salary was government-based. Luckily, my boss at work backed me, and so did the Children's Aid. The groups happened. It's at times like this that I personally need to recuperate in women-only space. I'm telling you that story because it infuriates me. Not just for myself, but because most of the lesbian feminists that I know are passionate about doing something to help, in particular, children and women who have been harmed, usually by men. It infuriates me that we are cast as the biased enemy when we are focused on a global crisis in which women and girls not only but most often are being violated, kept in servitude, beaten, brutally attacked, and killed. It infuriates me that while we donate our time because our hearts are breaking at the treatment of our sisters and daughters, that men in power have not stepped forward in large numbers to stop other men from this behavior and work with us to undo this patriarchal system, teaching boys that it's not only not okay, but that it is okay, not only okay, but essential to be gentle and respectful toward women and girls and toward each other. That schools have not been given the means to turn this around in one generation. That men who are violent continue to be free to repeat their violence at will. And that these men continue to complain about our selfish focus on those who are losing their lives. Most often women and girls. It's because of this that I personally need to recuperate in women-only space. It's in women's space that I have learned to transform that fury into action. So, by this time in history, there was news of a giant festival for one precious week in the summer, every summer, held in Michigan, USA, for women. A festival that was built by women, for women, to experience 1 week of peace in the year, a place to gather together, to share stories, to make plans, a place of primarily lesbian feminists who knew that we needed the chance to be in the woods together and to experience what we could build together as a community, to strengthen ourselves for the work that we did and do in the other weeks of the year. It was a place for women, musicians, dancers, comedians, and poets who, like all women, were having a hard time getting access to stages, could come and perform and get known. And where we could all learn the power of changing this around, booking these extraordinary artists in our home communities. It was a time to be alone together in the woods, to gather ourselves for the work that we were all doing in our own communities toward a peaceful world. I got myself there by the 1980s and felt free in a way I had never before, inspired on a level I had never imagined, healed to a depth I had not even dreamed was possible, healed to a depth, learned what women are capable of. We were in the woods together, learning how to build a community, to build our own strength, for our own inspiration, for what we were all doing to heal society outside that 1 week in our own communities. It was a time to watch our daughters run safely in the woods. It was a time to encourage the young boys that gentleness is more fun. It was a precious time together. And we took what we learned home with us for the benefit of everyone. This was a time uninterrupted to experience what we as women, and famously in the majority as lesbians and as feminists, inspired in each other to continue our work. This was women-only space. This was that little camp of 250 in Denmark, magnified into 8,000 to 10,000 at its highest numbers. One small week in the year to gather our strength, deepen our connections with each other, learn how to do what we were doing at an even higher frequency. Michigan became famous because it was that special. I had to miss going for 20 years because I wanted to do organic farming on women's land. By the 1980s to 1990s, many women's lands had sprung up. Women alone, in couples, in collectives, in communes. Some had men visit at times. Some were women only. All of them were havens where women could live close to the earth, not for 1 week, as Michigan was able to offer, but as a way of living. These women's lands dotted across North America, countries in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of the world, and we stayed in touch with each other and shared ideas of how to plant, build things, fix equipment, hold events, and offer safe haven to a lot of women escaping violence, needing time in nature. Many of us had been to Michigan, and because of that, we were able to understand the power and the healing that comes from creating a space in the country for women and girls to be in nature and free of all we experience in the larger world. We knew it from Michigan and other festivals that have also been happening for years now. And we knew it from living in the woods ourselves. After 20 years, I did move back to the city where I live today in Montreal. And by stopping farming, I was once again free to return to Michigan and to go to and also to go to a local drum camp for women here in Canada. As always, being on land with women feeds my soul. I always leave stronger, filled with new ways to take care of myself, stay strong in body and spirit for the work I believe I'm here to do on earth. To do everything I can to end this violence and suppression of women and girls. I had had many chances to meet with women over the years, but I had missed Michigan fiercely because of being able to experience what 6,000 to 10,000 women are capable of creating together. So I was beyond thrilled to be able to go back, and especially as Michigan, as we knew it, was about to close. I had the unforgettable chance to experience how this festival had grown in the 20 years that I had missed it, by attending the final 2 years of Michigan as it had become. Here is what I want everyone to know and understand. In the 1980s to mid-90s, when I went, there was a deep learning curve in how to do this, how to be together on the land in women-only space, how to build together the ability to grow and change, the ability to talk through differences, the ability to create healing energy for all of the wounds that women arrived with from our lives, from our treatment of women in our home communities, from our treatment from the psychological and physical harm that we had endured recently, as well as the past wounds surfacing there on the land, because often, for the first time in our lives, we felt safe and cared for. Where we could drum together and learn from women who had been beaten for drumming, knowing that in the distant past, women had drummed. Where we could learn dance that strengthens and heals us for the work that we do in our home communities. Because most of the women dedicated to Michigan and other women's festivals know that these are the oases of healing for the work that we do in our home communities. And that the feeling of safety is something that women rarely feel anywhere. But I want to express that what I found after missing 20 festivals, returning to for the last two, As the festival opened, the level of energy, the depths of the healing powers, the music, the messages from the stage had moved to a higher level than I had in my absence ever even imagined possible. The performances and the teachers, the performers and the teachers were primarily women of color. The community who had been meeting all these years had developed ways to solve problems peacefully. The girls who had experienced years of Michigan knew that freedom of walking in the woods with complete safety. The ceremony was powerful and magnificent, capable of transformation. And we were in deep pain that the festival as we knew it was about to close. But we carry it in our bones. As I looked over the crowd toward the end of that 40th year, I could see the wisdom of and the strength of all of those women who had been to this festival over the years. What we learned and experienced stays with us, and we are all still here in our communities, finding new ways to stay in touch with each other. Knowing that being in contact with each other, with what we know, and with what we have learned together through Women Only Space and Women Only Festivals or Women Only Discussions is part of who we are, part of what we needed to be the activists and the healers that we are today. We know the value of women meeting with each other, unfettered, and not holding back on the conversations we need to have to create the changes we know need to happen in this world. This is the power of Women Only Space. This is why we need to be with each other sometimes. This does not mean that we are not busy, attentive to, working with everyone else to create a better world when we're not in meetings with each other. It does mean that when we as lesbian feminists and as feminist women, we have the chance to meet, share news, plan and heal with each other, we emerge stronger for our work with this world, still so full of violence, still so full of silencing women, still so full of women and girls imprisoned, horrendously treated, maliciously tortured, and murdered. For me, it's been 53 years as a feminist and 49 as a lesbian, and only now am I realizing the determination behind this stranglehold that the majority of men continue to impose on women and girls. I hear change takes time. I hear it's always been this way. I hear some things will never change. I hear men expect to be in control in that culture. And in 50 years, in a country that prides itself on being an egalitarian, free society, men and boys in Canada are still getting away with violence toward women and girls. My hope these days lies in holding on to what we know is possible from our experiences together. Now, before I close, I want to talk about World Pulse, because World Pulse has become my home base, because I want all of you to know about this amazing network. It's what so many of us have hoped for all our lives, a global movement of loving, dedicated women and others who understand and are committed as well to ending every form of violence and suppression of women and girls globally, and for a better life for everyone and for the earth herself. At this point, in World Pulse, we are 70,000 from 190 countries. Membership in World Pulse is free. It's based on the stories that women are writing in about our lives, our communities, what's happening, what happened to us, what needs to happen, and how we're going to make it change. The love that I felt in Michigan and at other women's events is the same as the love flowing in World Pulse as we draw close to each other, getting to know each other, reading each other's stories, knowing each other's work, finding ways to support each other toward freedom for women and girls everywhere. The message is global. Listen to the women. The world is starving for women's leadership. It's in women's voices that I see change happening. It's in women's leadership that I see what's possible. It's from global networks like World Pulse and from sister organizations whose focus is also global. Women were scheduled to take place to, a meeting of women was scheduled to take place at the UN, and they have written a blueprint for dealing with this new virus, a feminist plan, a plan that begins with those who have the least. So let's lift up each other's work. We do have computers now. Log on and read some stories on World Pulse and jump in. World Pulse gives me every day the chance to be part of building this global network with powerful, dedicated women all over the world. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Finding and becoming part of World Pulse for me has been a dream come true. Just to finish, about women-only space. Why would anyone want to object to women meeting sometimes as women? We are stronger when we emerge from these times to meet everyone and every problem in our communities. We have healing to do of ourselves and each other because of the violence we've experienced in the past and in everyday life. We're in deep pain with every story we read. We're in deep pain knowing what so many women and girls are facing still daily. But now we have each other. We need to continue to find ways to meet with each other, to talk freely, and to heal, to continue our work for the benefit of everyone. It's the patriarchy that's threatened by our meeting with each other. We're demonized for wanting this time with each other, despite the pain we carry, and despite, or perhaps because of, the ideas that we spark when we speak freely with each other. We are breaking the rules. Despite the pain, we're continually working to heal and continue to come forward as leaders toward a new world society. It's Indigenous women in Canada who continue to hang red dresses out to remember the missing and murdered Indigenous women in this country. It's women in Mexico who went on strike recently against the violence against women in their country. A day without women. Another way to create women-only space for a day. It's the Indigenous women of the Amazon who are protecting their land. It's the women in Brazil, Argentina, and Colombia who are in the streets to end violence against women now. It's the women in Cameroon and Sudan and Yemen and the DRC who are calling for peace and an end to rape, destruction, and ruin. It's the women in Pakistan who are calling for an end to the imprisonment and killing of women. It's the women in 190s on World Pulse who are calling for change and documenting the changes that are needed. It's the women of World Pulse who are forming a global sisterhood, who are continuing with our messages of love to each other. This is feminism. working to end violence against anyone, working against poverty, working to protect the earth. And for many of us, this is lesbian feminism. Women who dare to step out of the patriarchal norm, knowing the full brunt of this patriarchy, knowing its lies and its tricks and its violent means to stay in place. We love women, and we're here to create change. Okay, I'm really going to finish with a quote from Audre Lorde. And I really look forward to our discussion. And after this is over, remember now we do have computers and we have cell phones, and so we have each other. So from Audre Lorde, you do not have to be me in order for us to fight alongside each other. I don't have to be you to recognize that our wars are the same. What we must do is commit ourselves to some future that can include each other and to work toward that future with the particular strengths of our individual identities. And in order to do this, we must allow each other our differences at the same time as we recognize our sameness. Audre Lorde. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and I so look forward to our discussion. I hope you have enjoyed this walk through the life of one lesbian feminist. We're here to do this.